Welcome to the History Maps podcast. There is a specific kind of terror in being trapped in a pitch-black tunnel 50 feet underground.
Yeah, the air is heavy, completely stagnant. It is thick with limestone dust and, the sharp smell of sulfur.
You are crawling on your hands and knees in the absolute dark, pressing your ear against the cold dirt. You are listening for a very specific sound.
Right, that faint rhythmic tink, tink, tink of enemy pickaxes. Because if you misjudge where that sound is coming from, or if you are just a few minutes too late, thousands of pounds of black powder will ignite.
And you, along with the heavy stone fortifications of the city above you, will be blown into the sky.
That claustrophobic reality was the daily existence for both the defenders and the attackers during the Siege of Vienna in 1683.
Today we are going to dissect how a grueling 2-month siege, fought largely underground and in the rubble of shattered walls, culminated in the largest cavalry charge in military history.
Exactly, and this single event permanently shifted the geopolitical balance of the European continent.
We are pulling from a substantial collection of sources for this deep dive. We have historical journals, comprehensive encyclopedia entries, highly detailed military analyses of the specific weapons and tactics, and the actual records of diplomatic communications.
Before we dive into the troop movements and the subterranean warfare, we must establish a framework for how we handle the language of the era.
Right, because the primary sources from the 17th century are heavily laden with religious and civilizational rhetoric. Terms like jihad, holy war, and crusade are frequently invoked by the kings and sultans involved.
And our goal here is to examine those concepts impartially. We are looking at them strictly as historical motivations, utilized by the empires involved to mobilize their populations, secure funding, and justify their territorial ambitions.
We are not taking any ideological sides. We are simply observing how this rhetoric functioned as a practical tool of statecraft in 17th century warfare.
To understand the summer of 1683, we have to pull back and look at the broader geopolitical chessboard. We are examining a collision between massive empires, and it is crucial to understand their internal conditions.
Let us start in the East, with the Ottoman Empire. At this juncture, they project the image of a massive superpower. However, the sources indicate that structural and economic fragmentation was beginning to show beneath the surface.
Yeah, the global economy was undergoing a massive transition. For centuries, the wealth of the Islamic empires, the Ottomans and the Safavids in Iran, was heavily reliant on controlling the overland Silk Road networks.
But European maritime expansion fundamentally altered this.
Right. The Portuguese, the Dutch, and the English were establishing dominant direct sea routes around Africa to India and the Spice Islands.
So they are essentially bypassing the Ottoman toll booths. The massive revenue stream that funded their state and their military is drying up because the trade is happening on galleons in the ocean.
Exactly. This loss of direct trade revenue led to severe economic pressure and inflation. Compounding this economic squeeze were internal leadership challenges.
The 17th century saw frequent leadership crises in the palace and a gradual decentralization of power away from the Sultan and toward powerful regional governors.
Though the sources mention that certain social structures remain highly resilient, like the WAP system.
Can you explain how that functioned to hold society together while the central government struggled?
Well, the WAP refers to charitable endowments under Islamic law. Wealthy individuals would endow properties, and the revenues generated were strictly designated for public goods.
Like building mosques, schools, hospitals, or providing food for the poor.
Right, and because these endowments were protected under religious law, they were largely immune to state confiscation. So the WAP system provided a robust social safety net that kept the cities functioning.
But a social safety net does not win wars, and there is a significant technological hurdle they were facing with their massive army.
European military structures were innovating rapidly, and the Ottomans were encountering severe friction in adapting their command structures and weapons technology.
The primary source of this friction came from within their own elite military ranks, specifically the Janissaries.
Historically, the Janissaries were the cutting edge of the Ottoman military. But by the late 17th century, they had become a powerful, entrenched political faction.
They fiercely resisted modernization. When military reformers tried to introduce new European-style drills or newer flintlock muskets, the Janissaries pushed back to preserve their traditional methods.
So you have this massive empire, economically squeezed, but struggling with a military establishment that refuses to adapt. Now, let us look at their primary rival across the border, the Habsburg monarchy.
If the Ottomans were straining, the Habsburg position sounds incredibly precarious.
It was a deeply vulnerable position. Emperor Leopold I was ruling over a highly decentralized domain, and his strategic attention was completely divided.
His primary distraction was not in the east, but in the west, in the form of King Louis XIV of France.
France and the Habsburgs had a bitter, entrenched rivalry, and the sources highlight a tacit, informal alignment between the French and the Ottomans.
It was not a formal military alliance where they marched together, but France actively encouraged Ottoman militancy in the east.
The strategic logic for France was simple. If the Ottoman Sultan kept the Habsburgs tied down in a massive, costly war on their eastern borders, defending Vienna, the Austrians could not counter French expansion along the Rhine.
It is the classic two-front war dilemma. Louis XIV is essentially outsourcing his eastern problem to the Ottomans.
And this creates a highly volatile situation in Central Europe. The spark that finally ignited this massive war came from Hungary.
The region of Hungary was a fractured borderland. In the Habsburg-controlled territories, Emperor Leopold I was aggressively pursuing counter-Reformation policies.
Meaning he was actively and harshly trying to suppress Protestantism in his lands to enforce Catholic uniformity.
He utilized heavy taxation, the confiscation of Protestant churches, and the expulsion of ministers.
This heavy-handed approach sparked widespread, violent unrest among the Hungarian nobility and peasantry, culminating in the Kuruk Rebellion.
The rebellion was led by a Hungarian nobleman named Imre Thököly. He organized these anti-Habsburg forces, and the Ottomans saw their window of opportunity.
They stepped in and offered substantial military and financial support to the rebels. The Ottomans recognized Thököly as the king of Upper Hungary.
But the diplomatic records reveal an even more aggressive promise. The Ottomans explicitly promised Thököly that they would grant him the Kingdom of Vienna.
That is a massive escalation. They are explicitly stating their intent to capture and dismantle the Habsburg capital and install a proxy ruler.
Faced with this reality, the Habsburgs recognized they were unprepared for a major mobilization. This initiated an intense period of diplomatic desperation in Istanbul.
The Habsburg strategy was entirely focused on buying time. They utilized envoys like Georg Christoph von Kunitz and Alberto Capura to negotiate an extension to the Peace of Westphal.
That was a treaty signed 20 years prior that had maintained a tense peace along the border.
But they found themselves facing the Ottoman Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. And he had absolutely no intention of renewing the peace. He utilized calculated stalling tactics.
The sources outline the impossible conditions he presented. For example, he demanded that the Habsburgs pay a massive sum of money for alleged damages inflicted on border towns.
The Habsburg envoys recognized these demands as pretext for war. Kara Mustafa was setting conditions he knew Leopold could never accept.
Furthermore, the envoys were effectively held captive in Istanbul. This diplomatic breakdown reached its terminal point in August 1682.
That is when the Sultan's horsetail banners were officially raised at Topkapi Palace, the traditional Ottoman signal for a declaration of war.
Let us unpack this sequence of events, because the common historical narrative often paints this as the Ottomans simply surging into Europe unprovoked on a sudden whim.
Right, but looking at the mechanics of this, that framing does not hold up.
It feels much more like a pressure cooker. You have a massive empire feeling the economic squeeze of global trade shifts. You have years of border skirmishes.
And you have the French quietly turning up the heat in the West.
Exactly. And then this proxy rebellion in Hungary provides the perfect entry point. When Kara Mustafa finally raises those banners in August, it is not a whim. It is the inevitable explosion of a pressure cooker that had been heating up for decades.
That is a precise reading of the environment. The declaration of war was the culmination of long-term strategic calculations. Kara Mustafa Pasha saw a rapidly closing window of opportunity.
His objective was securing absolute control over the Danube River network and the overland trade routes stretching into central Germany.
Once that decision was finalized, the scale of the Ottoman mobilization was staggering. We are looking at an army comprising between 90,000 and 150,000 troops.
We need to break down this force because it was not just standard infantrymen. You have the core professional standing army, including the elite Janissary infantry and the Sipahi cavalry.
But those professional corps units only made up a portion of the total number. The bulk came from provincial levies and vast auxiliary forces.
The most prominent among these were the Crimean Tatars. The Ottoman host was joined by somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 Tatar light cavalrymen.
Moving an army of over 100,000 men, plus tens of thousands of horses and pack animals, is a logistical undertaking that is difficult to fully comprehend.
Right, how do you physically move a city's worth of soldiers across a continent in the 17th century?
The logistics dictated the entire timeline of the war. They departed near Istanbul in early 1683, marching through the Balkans to Belgrade and then pushing north.
They had to send engineering corps ahead to repair roads, reinforce bridges, and establish massive supply depots.
They were funneling grain, gunpowder, and livestock from every corner of the empire to sustain this moving column. It was an extended march of over 1,000 miles.
Which brings us to a crucial point about the timeline. War was formally declared in August 1682, but the Siege of Vienna did not actually begin until July 1683.
The timing is dictated by the seasons. The Ottomans could not launch a major invasion into Central Europe in the late summer. A typical campaign would have them arriving at Vienna just as the harsh winter was setting in.
An army of that size would simply freeze and starve in the field. Therefore, they declared war, mobilized over the winter, and launched the march in the spring.
This created a roughly 15-month gap between the raising of the banners and the arrival of the vanguard at Vienna.
And that gap was the only thing that kept the Austrian Empire alive. It provided Emperor Leopold I the necessary time to frantically prepare the physical defense of his capital.
As the summer of 1683 approached, and the sheer scale of the incoming host became apparent, panic set in.
Emperor Leopold, along with his entire court and a large portion of the nobility, evacuated the city. They fled westward up the Danube to Linz and eventually Passau.
He left the defense of the capital entirely in the hands of Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, a highly experienced military commander.
When the emperor fled, Starhemberg was left with a garrison of roughly 11,000 professional troops, which he quickly supplemented with civilian militias.
Starhemberg understood that his force was massively outnumbered. His preparations for the siege were utterly ruthless, but necessary.
He centralized his defenses, concentrated his artillery batteries, and organized mandatory companies of civilian firefighters.
Because he knew the Ottomans would utilize incendiary weapons to burn the city from the outside. But his most severe tactical decision happened outside the city walls.
Starhemberg ordered the systematic razing of all the suburbs surrounding Vienna. He commanded his troops to burn down every house, tavern, barn, and orchard immediately outside the perimeter.
The destruction was absolute. Thousands of civilians lost their homes and livelihoods in a matter of days by order of their own commander.
I want to focus on the logic of this decision. Burning down your own city's suburbs sounds like madness, but in the context of siege warfare, it is pure physics.
It is entirely necessary for survival.
Think of it like a controlled burn in a massive forest fire. You deliberately destroy the fuel in front of the advancing fire so it has nothing to consume.
By leveling the suburbs, Starhemberg denied the Ottoman army any physical cover. They couldn't hide their troops or their cannons behind a row of houses.
He created a massive open field of fire for his own artillery. Anyone approaching the city had to walk across a flat, burning wasteland.
And he eliminated any resources, food, or shelter that the besieging army could use to sustain themselves.
It is the brutal mathematical logic of 17th century defensive warfare. You destroy the periphery to save the core.
And Starhemberg's resolve was hardened by the intelligence he was receiving. A defining incident occurred at the town of Perchtoldsdorf, just south of Vienna.
The narrative vignette from Perchtoldsdorf is chilling. As the Tatar cavalry swept through, the citizens were surrounded and offered terms of surrender.
They were told to hand over the keys and their lives would be spared. The townsfolk, knowing they had no military garrison, complied.
The historical records detail that upon surrendering, the promise of safety was immediately broken. The Ottoman forces entered the town and initiated a mass slaughter of the civilian population.
News of this massacre flooded into Vienna just days before the main Ottoman army arrived.
So when Kara Mustafa Pasha arrived on July 14th and sent the formal demand for the city to surrender, Starhemberg already knew the reality of the situation.
He had the reports from Perchtoldsdorf. He knew the capitulation offered no guarantee of safety. He categorically refused the demand, sending a message that he intended to fight to the last drop of blood.
With the refusal delivered, the siege operations commenced on July 17th. The Ottoman forces moved into the cleared, burned-out zone around the city.
They completely encircled Vienna with an initial force of roughly 70,000 frontline troops. They severed every single road and supply line leading into the capital.
Kara Mustafa has this massive army surrounding the city. He needs to break the walls. But the sources note a massive logistical failure. They did not bring enough heavy artillery.
Moving heavy siege cannons over 1,000 miles of rough terrain was incredibly slow. The Ottomans opted for mobility, bringing only about 60 medium-caliber cannons.
And a medium cannon is not going to do much against a European star fort. Vienna's walls were heavily reinforced with earth and stone.
A medium cannonball would just hit the earthwork, sink into the dirt, and do zero structural damage.
Since they couldn't batter the walls down from a distance, they had to change their methodology entirely.
If you cannot go through the wall with artillery, and you cannot go over it because of musket fire, the only remaining option is to go beneath it.
The Ottomans relied on a highly complex system of combat engineering and subterranean warfare.
This was not a new tactic. They had spent decades perfecting these methods during the massive siege of Candia on the island of Crete, which concluded in 1669.
Explain how this process actually worked on the ground, because it is a highly systematic approach.
Ottoman sappers, primarily utilizing the Janissary Corps, began digging a massive network of trenches in the fields surrounding Vienna.
They did not dig straight toward the walls, because that would expose the trench to fire from the bastions.
Instead, they dug parallel trenches, zigzagging their way closer to the defensive structures. This allowed them to move thousands of troops right up to the base of the walls while remaining completely hidden below ground level.
Once the trenches reached the base of the fortifications, specifically targeting massive platforms known as the Lobelbastei and the Burgbastei, the true subterranean warfare began.
The sappers tunneled directly downward and horizontally beneath the stone foundations of the bastions. Their objective was to excavate large chambers beneath the structural weak points.
And then pack those chambers with massive quantities of black powder. They're essentially constructing massive underground bombs to blow the foundation out from under the wall,
causing it to collapse into the trench and create a ramp of rubble that the infantry can charge up.
But Starhemberg's men were not just waiting to explode. They realized what was happening, which initiated the countermining operations.
The Viennese defenders formed their own teams of engineers. They began digging defensive tunnels out from the city basements, attempting to intercept the Ottoman sappers deep underground.
How do you find a tunnel in the pitch black without modern acoustics or radar?
They used rudimentary acoustic methods. The defenders would place bowls of water on the floor of their tunnels, watching the surface for ripples caused by the vibrations of enemy pickaxes.
Or they would place a drum with dried peas resting on the skin. If the peas began to bounce, they knew the Ottomans were digging close by, and they could estimate the direction.
So they track the vibrations, dig toward the enemy tunnel, and eventually they break through. And when they do, you have Austrian militiamen and Ottoman sappers meeting in a dirt tunnel 50 feet underground.
Illuminated only by lantern light?
Yeah.
And they could not use firearms, right?
Correct. Firing a musket in a confined space filled with highly volatile black powder dust would instantly ignite a massive explosion, killing everyone.
Therefore, the combat was entirely hand-to-hand, utilizing short swords, daggers, pickaxes, and spades in incredibly tight claustrophobic conditions.
The objective for the defenders was to locate the packed powder chambers, neutralize the Ottoman sappers in the dark, and physically haul the barrels of gunpowder back into the city before the fuse could be lit.
Despite the desperate efforts of the Austrian counterminers, they could not stop every tunnel. The Ottomans successfully detonated multiple major mines beneath the bastions throughout August and early September.
These detonations caused massive structural collapses, shearing off the faces of the stone walls and creating viable breaches.
Whenever a mine detonated, a massive plume of smoke and masonry would fill the air, and the Janissaries would surge out of their trenches, charging up the rubble.
The defenders had to frantically erect barricades out of timber, overturn carts, and debris right in the middle of the gap, fighting off wave after wave of Ottoman infantry.
The sources mention that Starhemberg himself was in the thick of it, leading a desperate countercharge on September 4 to repel a major Janissary advance at a critical breach in the Burgbastei.
While the combat on the walls was relentless, the conditions inside the city were deteriorating at an alarming rate.
The complete encirclement by 70,000 troops meant that all supply lines were dead. The food reserves for the 11,000 soldiers and the tens of thousands of trapped civilians were rapidly exhausted.
They were reduced to starvation rations. First, they ate the horses, then the dogs and cats, and eventually whatever vermin they could capture.
But starvation wasn't the primary killer. It was biology. The city's sanitation infrastructure collapsed almost immediately.
You have thousands of people crammed together in cellars to avoid the bombardment, and there's no way to safely dispose of the dead bodies or the human waste.
This created the perfect environment for rampant disease. Dysentery, terrifyingly referred to in the medical records of the time as the Red Flux, swept through the military garrison and the civilian population.
Thousands died from dehydration and intestinal hemorrhaging caused by contaminated water and unsanitary conditions.
The physical and psychological toll on the defenders is hard to fathom. They are starving, they are sick, and they are fighting off daily assaults in the sweltering summer heat.
The fatigue was so pervasive that the military structure threatened to break down entirely. To maintain the defense, Starhemberg was forced to implement severe discipline.
Morale was failing, and soldiers were simply collapsing at their posts. Starhemberg issued strict standing orders. Any soldier found sleeping while on watch was to be shot immediately.
There was no margin for error. A sleeping sentry could mean a missed Ottoman infiltration and the fall of the entire city.
By the first week of September, the situation was catastrophic. Out of the original garrison of 11,000 professional troops, only about 3,800 men remained combat effective.
They had successfully repelled at least 18 major coordinated infantry assaults, but their ammunition was nearly gone.
Which raises a critical question about Ottoman strategic command. If the city was completely cut off, starving, ravaged by plague, and physically crumbling, why didn't Kara Mustafa Pasha simply halt the costly infantry assaults?
It is a fundamental question of siege logistics.
Right, why risk the lives of thousands of your elite janissaries in direct assaults on fortified barricades? If the city is already dying from within, why not just maintain the blockade and let starvation finish the job?
The primary reason for Kara Mustafa's urgency was his awareness of the wider theater of war. His scouting network, primarily the Tatar light cavalry, was sending back alarming reports. European forces were massing in the west.
He knows a relief army is...
The surrounding countryside had been stripped bare of forage and grain. The Ottoman army was beginning to suffer from severe supply shortages and disease within their own sprawling encampments.
They desperately needed the wealth and resources they believed were still hoarded inside Vienna.
That urgency was entirely justified, because while Vienna was bleeding out, a massive diplomatic effort was bearing fruit.
Emperor Leopold I, operating from exile in Passau, and Pope Innocent XI in Rome were frantically forging an alliance that many thought was impossible, the Holy League.
Pope Innocent XI was the linchpin of this operation. His role was deeply pragmatic and financial. He utilized the vast wealth of the papacy to essentially underwrite the war effort.
Because war in the 17th century is brutally expensive. You have to buy the muskets, cast the cannons, procure the gunpowder, and pay the wages.
He transferred massive financial subsidies to the various European princes to fund the equipping, feeding, and marching of their armies.
The Pope is acting as the central bank for this military coalition. But the money is only half the battle. This alliance required overcoming incredibly deep confessional hatreds.
We are only a few decades removed from the 30 Years' War, a conflict that saw Catholics and Protestants slaughtering each other across Germany.
And yet, in the face of the Ottoman advance, you see a sudden, pragmatic realignment. Catholic forces are actively aligning and marching alongside staunchly Protestant German states.
Most notably, the Electorate of Saxony and the Electorate of Bavaria, the Elector of Bavaria, Maximilian II Emmanuel, and the Saxon Elector, John George III, agreed to contribute thousands of heavily armed troops.
And let us be clear, based on the sources, this was not driven by some sudden, unified religious enlightenment. This was driven by cold, hard self-preservation.
They possessed a clear understanding of the geopolitical map. If Vienna fell to the Ottomans, the road into central Germany was wide open.
The Protestant princes recognized that their own territories, their own cities and wealth were next in the path of Kara Mustafa's expansion.
Defending Catholic Vienna was the most effective way to defend Protestant Bavaria and Saxony. But the most crucial piece of this complex coalition puzzle came from the north.
King John III Sobieski of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Earlier in the year, he had signed the Treaty of Warsaw with Emperor Leopold.
It was a mutual defense pact, stipulating that if either the Polish capital of Krakow or the Austrian capital of Vienna were attacked by the Ottomans, the other would march to their aid.
When the call came that Vienna was besieged, Sobieski honored the treaty. He initiated a massive mobilization, gathering a force of roughly 20,000 Polish-Lithuanian troops,
which included his renowned elite heavy cavalry. The logistics of Sobieski's march are truly substantial.
He led his army on a rapid, brutal 400-kilometer forced march from Krakow, southward across the rugged terrain of the Carpathian Mountains.
To achieve the speed necessary to reach Vienna before it fell, they traveled incredibly light, abandoning much of their heavy baggage and artillery.
We must also acknowledge the strategic risk Sobieski was taking. By committing his primary field army to the relief of Vienna, he was leaving his own southern borders utterly exposed.
He knew that the Ottomans' Tatar auxiliaries specialized in deep, rapid raids into undefended territory. He was risking the devastation of Polish towns to honor his treaty obligations.
By the first week of September, all these disparate pieces, the Austrians, the Bavarians, the Saxons, the Swabians, and the Poles, began to converge at a designated staging area called Toln under Donau.
It was a town located on the Danube River just northwest of Vienna. We're looking at the assembly of a combined relief force numbering between 70,000 and 80,000 combatants.
The sheer complexity of coordinating this assembly is intense. You have massive armies arriving from different directions, speaking different languages, utilizing different command structures.
Yet they managed to unite under the supreme command of King John III Sobieski, recognizing him as the senior monarch and the most experienced field commander against Ottoman forces.
While the army was assembling at Toln, they had a major intelligence problem. They had no idea what was actually happening inside Vienna.
Were the walls still standing? Had the garrison surrendered? They needed to coordinate the timing of their attack with the defenders inside the city.
Ensuring that Starhemberg's men would launch a sortie at the exact moment the relief army hit the Ottoman rear. This necessity resulted in a fascinating espionage mission involving Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki.
Kulczycki was a Polish nobleman, a trader, and a diplomat who had spent years operating in the East. Crucially, he was fluent in Turkish and possessed a deep understanding of Ottoman customs.
Kulczycki volunteers for a mission that borders on the suicidal. He has to get out of a city entirely surrounded by 70,000 hostile troops, deliver a message to the relief army, and then sneak back in.
He puts on a disguise. He dresses in traditional Ottoman attire, slips out a side gate in the dead of night with a servant, and just walks through the massive Ottoman siege camp.
He relied entirely on his linguistic fluency and cultural knowledge. When challenged by Ottoman patrols, he reportedly claimed to be a merchant from Belgrade supplying the troops.
Casually chatting with the sentries in perfect Turkish to allay their suspicions, he successfully reaches the relief army and delivers Starhemberg's urgent intelligence.
And then, incredibly, sneaks back through the Ottoman lines into Vienna to confirm that the Allied army is arriving.
His efforts allowed the Confederated troops to finalize their attack plans, signaling their readiness to the besieged city by lighting massive bonfires on the surrounding hills.
However, while we observe this assembly of European power at Toln, it is equally important to note who was deliberately absent from this coalition.
We had the Austrians, the Germans, and the Poles. But the wealthiest, most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe, King Louis XIV of France, provided absolutely no troops, no money, and no support.
Which highlights the immense irony of the era's rhetoric. Pope Innocent XI is framing this entire Holy League as a desperate defense of Christendom.
And yet, the most powerful Christian king refuses to participate. In fact, he actively exploits the situation.
While the emperor is pouring every ounce of his military and financial strength into defending his eastern capital, Louis XIV uses the opportunity to launch the War of the Reunions.
He marches French armies eastward, aggressively annexing territory along his borders, most notably the region of Alsace. He capitalized on the existential threat to the Habsburgs for his own immediate territorial aggrandizement.
It is the ultimate display of realpolitik. Religion and civilization are the marketing campaigns used to rally the troops, but territory and power are the actual products being traded by the kings.
With the geopolitical lines drawn and the coalition finally assembled at Toln, the relief army began its final approach toward Vienna.
On September 11th, the day before the battle, the coalition faced a severe geographical challenge. To strike the Ottoman siege camp effectively, they had to maneuver their massive army through the dense, rugged terrain of the Vienna woods.
The Allied objective was to secure the heights of Kahlenberg, a prominent hill overlooking the city. But moving an army of 80,000 men, dragging heavy artillery and powder wagons up steep inclines, is a logistical nightmare.
The historical accounts note that the maps provided to the Allied commanders were often wildly inaccurate or misleading.
Columns of troops would march down a path only to find it ended in an impassable gorge, forcing them to backtrack and causing massive delays.
Artillerymen had to unhitch their horses, which were floundering in the mud, and use hundreds of men with ropes to physically drag the cannons up the steep slopes.
Despite the chaos and the physical exhaustion, securing Kallenberg was the decisive strategic maneuver of the entire campaign. By the evening of September 11, the grueling climb was completed.
The Austro-German contingents, commanded by Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, deployed along the left wing, occupying positions between Leopoldsburg and Hermannskogel.
The Polish forces under Sobieski secured the rugged terrain on the right wing. This positioning granted the coalition an overwhelming tactical advantage.
Explain the physics of this advantage. Why does holding the high ground matter so much here?
It dictates the momentum of the battle. From Kallenberg, the Allied commanders could look directly down onto the sprawling Ottoman siege lines.
They were positioned at the Ottoman rear. If they attacked, gravity would be entirely on their side, amplifying the force of their infantry pushes and cavalry charges.
More importantly, it allowed them to squeeze the Ottoman forces against two immovable barriers: the Danube River to the north and the heavily defended walls of Vienna to the south.
And crucially, the Ottomans had constructed almost no defensive fortifications facing the hills.
For 2 months, all of their digging, all of their trenching, and all of their artillery placement had been directed inward, facing the city walls. Their rear, facing the Vienna woods, was completely soft and exposed.
The Battle of Vienna commenced before dawn, roughly around 4 o'clock in the morning on September 12.
The Ottoman command was aware of the Allied presence on the heights and sought to disrupt their final deployment. The Ottoman vanguard launched a preemptive attack up the slopes.
The Austro-German forces on the Allied left wing, commanded by Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, absorbed the initial shock and then launched a massive coordinated counterattack.
The fighting on the left wing was incredibly intense. Lorraine's infantry, heavily supported by precise artillery fire, pushed forward down the slopes, engaging heavy Ottoman resistance.
The combat centered around capturing key fortified villages located at the base of the hills, specifically Nussdorf and Heiligenstadt.
The fighting was house to house, utilizing musket volleys, pikes, and hand grenades to clear the Ottoman defenders from the structures.
By midday, the methodical pressure applied by the Imperial and German infantry was working. They had inflicted massive casualties, captured the crucial villages, and were threatening a complete breakthrough on the Ottoman right flank.
As this crisis unfolds on the Allied left, we need to analyze the actions of the Ottoman Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. This is where his command structure catastrophically fails.
He was facing an army of 80,000 fresh European troops descending upon his exposed rear.
Basic military doctrine dictates an immediate, full redeployment of his forces to meet this new existential threat. However, his focus remained fatally divided.
He refuses to let go of the city. He keeps a significant portion of his absolute best troops, his elite Janissary shock infantry, trapped in the trenches, focused entirely on the crumbling walls of Vienna.
His sappers had managed to prepare 10 final, massive powder mines beneath the defenses. Kara Mustafa was utterly obsessed with detonating those mines.
He believed that if he could just blast open the walls and capture the city, he could retreat his army behind the fortifications and use Vienna's own guns to fight off the relief force.
He held back his reserves for a simultaneous assault on the city that never fully materialized.
And the reason it didn't materialize is because the exhausted Viennese defenders underground, fighting in the dark, managed to locate and disarm those final 10 mines just before the fuses reached the powder.
This divided focus crippled the Ottoman response on the main battlefield. He was attempting to fight a desperate two-front battle simultaneously, and he failed to prioritize the immediate threat of the coalition army.
Compounding this error, his left flank was collapsing due to secret sabotage. Tell us about the Wallachians.
The Wallachian forces were an allied contingent, essentially an Ottoman vassal state from modern-day Romania. They had been stationed by Kara Mustafa to guard a crucial bridge over the Danube, which anchored the Ottoman left flank.
However, the Wallachian leadership secretly sympathized with the Christian coalition.
As the Austro-German forces advanced, the Wallachians simply abandoned their positions and withdrew from the bridge without firing a shot, completely exposing the Ottoman flank to encirclement.
If we look at Kara Mustafa's mindset, it is exactly like watching a desperate gambler sitting at a high-stakes table. He has spent 2 grueling months pouring his army's blood and his empire's treasury into the siege of Vienna.
He has bet everything on taking the city.
He believes he is 1 card away from winning. When a new player, the 80,000-strong relief army, sits down at the table with a massive stack of chips, he refuses to fold his hand.
He refuses to turn his attention away from the pot he thinks he has already won.
By stubbornly trying to win both hands simultaneously, keeping his eyes on the city while his back is being battered, he guarantees a total catastrophic loss on both fronts.
That analogy perfectly captures his strategic paralysis. As the afternoon progressed, the situation for the Ottoman army shifted from desperate to untenable.
The German and Austrian infantry in the center and on the left wing had been engaged in continuous grinding combat for over 8 hours.
They had successfully pinned down the Ottoman main lines, drawn their musket fire, depleted their ammunition reserves, and forced Khan Mustafa to commit all of his available reinforcements to plug the gaps.
Let us set the scene. It is late afternoon, somewhere between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock. The sun is beginning to lower.
The Ottoman infantry is pinned down in the vineyards and fields, completely exhausted from hours of relentless combat, choked by black powder smoke.
Their lines are stretched impossibly thin, and their morale is cratering as they realize their flank is exposed and the city is not falling.
And at that exact moment, emerging from the tree line high above them on the right wing, the Polish vanguard appears.
The Polish heavy cavalry, the renowned winged hussars, had spent the day slowly maneuvering into position through the difficult terrain of the Vienna woods.
Before we detail the mechanics of the charge itself, it is essential to understand the specific anatomy and engineering of these cavalry units because they were highly unique in 17th century warfare.
They were the product of military reforms initiated roughly a century earlier by King Stephen Bathory of Poland. They were not your standard lightly armored horsemen used for scouting or skirmishing.
They were elite shock troops designed for one specific purpose, breaking enemy infantry lines through pure, concentrated physical force. Every aspect of their equipment was highly specialized.
First, the horses themselves were meticulously crossbred. They combined the strength and size of Polish draft horses with the speed and endurance of Tatar steeds.
The resulting breed could carry the massive weight of a fully armored rider at a full gallop, maintain that speed over a long distance, and recover quickly enough for a second charge if necessary.
The weaponry was equally specialized. They rode using a unique high-backed wooden saddle design that locked the rider in place.
This allowed the hussar to absorb the massive kinetic impact of striking an enemy with a lance without being thrown backward off his horse.
And the lance itself, the copia, was an engineering marvel. It was incredibly long, often stretching up to 19 feet, which meant it was significantly longer than the pikes used by opposing infantry.
Crucially, the lance was hollowed out. It was constructed from light pine wood, hollowed down the center in two halves, and glued back together.
This made it light enough for one man to hold steady at a gallop.
But it was designed to shatter upon impact, delivering the maximum transfer of kinetic energy into the target without breaking the rider's arm.
And, of course, the defining visual characteristic, the wings. They wore large wooden frames mounted either to the back of their armor or to the saddle, heavily decorated with eagle, ostrich, or swan feathers.
There's been a lot of historical debate over what these wings actually did on the battlefield. Older historical theories speculated on a variety of practical functions.
Some suggested the wind whistling through the feathers created a loud, terrifying noise during a charge designed to panic enemy horses.
Others posited that the wooden frames protected the rider's neck and back from sword strikes, or prevented Tatar lassos from pulling them from the saddle.
However, modern historical consensus largely discounts those physical theories. The wings were primarily an instrument of immense psychological warfare.
They were designed for visual intimidation. When you mount massive wings on an already towering armored cavalryman, it makes the rider look significantly larger, wider, and completely inhuman.
If you are an exhausted Ottoman infantryman, standing in the smoke and mud, the sight of thousands of gleaming, armored, winged figures descending a hill toward you would have a profoundly demoralizing effect.
It was designed to break the enemy's mind before the lance broke their body.
At roughly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Sobieski initiated a tactical probe. He ordered a small detachment of roughly 120 hussars to launch a probing charge down the slope into the Ottoman lines.
The purpose of this was intelligence gathering. He needed to test the firmness of the ground, ensure there were no hidden ditches, spike pits, or concealed artillery batteries that could ruin a mass charge.
That small unit took heavy casualties, but the mission was successful. They proved the ground was clear, and they exposed the sluggish response time of the exhausted Ottoman formations.
With that critical intelligence confirmed, the relief army prepared for the decisive blow. At 6 o'clock in the evening, King John III Sobieski drew his sword and ordered the general advance.
This event is recorded by many military historians as the largest single cavalry charge in history. An estimated 18,000 horsemen surged forward, charging simultaneously down the slopes of Kahlenberg toward the Ottoman lines.
The composition of this charge was a massive, combined Allied effort. Sobieski personally led the vanguard, riding at the head of 3,000 elite Polish winged hussars.
But they were supported on their flanks by 15,000 heavy and light cavalrymen from the German and Austrian contingents.
It is also a notable historical footnote that this massive charge defending Christendom included Muslim cavalry fighting loyally for the Polish king. The Lipka Tatars, a group of Muslim Tatars who had settled in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth centuries prior, were part of the charge.
Which created a severe identification problem because the Ottoman army was also heavily utilizing Crimean Tatar cavalry, who wore similar armor and rode similar horses.
To avoid a catastrophic friendly fire incident in the chaos of the charge, the Polish commanders ordered the Lipka Tatars to tie a prominent sprig of straw into their helmets to clearly distinguish themselves from the enemy.
The visual and auditory impact of 18,000 armored horses thundering down a hillside into a static line must have been immense. But I have to ask about the mechanics of this because it seems counterintuitive.
What part seems counterintuitive?
By 1683, firearms dominate the battlefield. The Ottomans are armed with muskets, they have artillery positions, they are fighting from defensive trenches.
Right.
How does a massive, tightly packed formation of medieval-style heavy cavalry not just get completely annihilated by musket volleys before they even reach the front line?
It is a fundamental question, and the answer relies on the precise timing of the attack, combined arms tactics, and the specific physical state of the Ottoman army at 6 o'clock in the evening.
So it is all about context.
Exactly. As we discussed, the Austro-German infantry had spent the previous 10 hours brutally pinning the Ottomans down in the center and the left.
They had drawn constant musket fire, meaning the Ottoman soldiers had largely depleted their powder horns and lead shot.
They were physically exhausted. Their barrels were fouled with black powder residue, making reloading slow and dangerous, and their formations were entirely disorganized.
So they aren't facing a fresh, disciplined wall of muskets. They are facing men who are already broken, out of ammo, and looking over their shoulders.
Furthermore, the physics of the charge favored the cavalry. Because the hussars were charging downhill, utilizing the momentum of their specially bred horses, they accelerated at a terrifying rate.
A musket in 1683 was highly inaccurate at a distance and took roughly a minute to reload.
The sheer speed of the cavalry meant that the Ottoman infantry might only manage to fire a single panic volley before the hussars crossed the distance and were upon them.
Finally, the hussar armor was specifically designed to be thickest on the breastplate and sloped to deflect early, lower-velocity musket balls fired from a distance.
When that immense, concentrated mass of kinetic energy, 18,000 armored horses and thousands of shattering lances slammed into the fractured, exhausted Ottoman defensive line, the resistance simply evaporated.
The defense shattered instantly. The cavalry charge completely broke the Ottoman battle lines in under an hour. The organized defense devolved into a general, chaotic rout.
The Polish cavalry, carrying their momentum, drove straight through the infantry formations and penetrated deep into the massive Ottoman siege camps.
They rode right up to the Grand Vizier's headquarters. They captured Kara Mustafa's personal, opulent tents, his treasury, and the highly symbolic holy banner of the Ottoman army.
Seeing the enemy lines disintegrating, the surviving Viennese garrison, those 3,800 starving, exhausted men who had been fighting for their lives for 2 months, finally opened the city gates.
They sallied out to join the final assault, cutting down the retreating Ottoman troops in the trenches.
The battle, which had officially begun before dawn, was effectively over less than 3 hours after the cavalry charge commenced. The massive Ottoman army was in full disorganized flight eastward.
In the immediate aftermath, surveying the victory, King John III Sobieski summarized the event in his correspondence to the Pope by famously paraphrasing Julius Caesar, writing, "Venimus, vitimus, Deus visit. We came, we saw, God conquered."
The immediate aftermath on the battlefield was a scene of massive chaos and plundering. The Ottomans, in their desperate rush to escape the pursuing cavalry, completely abandoned their sprawling siege camp.
They left behind a fortune in military supplies. Thousands of tents, huge stockpiles of grain, massive herds of cattle and sheep, and their entire artillery train.
The looting of the Grand Vizier's personal encampment was legendary. Sobieski and his troops captured vast amounts of gold, silver, intricate textiles, and exotic goods.
There is a famous story that among the captured supplies, the Poles found massive sacks containing dark, bitter beans that they initially thought were camel feed.
But it turned out to be vast quantities of coffee.
The influx of captured Ottoman weapons, specifically curved sabers, intricate horse trappings, and vibrant textiles, heavily influenced Polish aristocratic fashion and arms designed for decades to follow.
For the Ottoman Empire, the retreat was a slow-motion disaster. They suffered immense casualties during the initial rout, and the suffering was compounded by harsh autumn weather setting in.
And relentless, localized pursuit by coalition forces and Hungarian militias. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, managed to escape the battlefield and retreat down the Danube to the city of Belgrade.
But the price of his catastrophic failure was absolute. The Sultan was not forgiving. Sultan Mehmed IV ordered his immediate execution.
The sources detail the exact protocol. On December 25, by order of the Sultan, the commander of the Janissary Guard entered Kara Mustafa's quarters in Belgrade.
He was executed by strangulation using a silk rope, pulled taut by several men on each end, a traditional method of execution for high-ranking Ottoman officials, ensuring no royal or noble blood was violently spilled on the ground.
And Kara Mustafa wasn't the only officer to face the rope. Before his own execution, Kara Mustafa desperately tried to scapegoat his subordinate commanders for the loss.
He executed several high-ranking officers during the chaotic retreat, most notably Ibrahim Pasha, the governor of Buda, who was executed specifically for ordering his forces to retreat from the collapsing lines.
The defeat at Vienna was not just a single lost battle. It marked the beginning of a massive macro-historical shift in global power.
The coalition victory at Vienna immediately initiated a prolonged, brutal conflict known as the Great Turkish War, which raged until 1699.
Following the relief of the city, the Holy League did not disband. They pressed their advantage. Sobieski and Charles V of Lorraine continued the offensive eastward.
A highly significant engagement occurred shortly after at the Battle of Parkany, where the Ottoman rearguard was decisively crushed. Over the next 16 years, the Holy League went on the offensive.
They systematically drove the Ottoman armies out of Central Europe, besieging and capturing key long-held Ottoman strongholds like Buda, and eventually retaking Belgrade.
This exhaustive conflict finally concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. The diplomatic and territorial consequences for the Ottomans were devastating.
They were forced to formally cede vast tracts of territory, including almost the entirety of Hungary, Transylvania, and significant portions of the Balkans, to the Habsburgs and their allies.
It permanently ended the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Central Europe. After 1683, they would never again pose a direct, existential threat to the heartland of the continent.
It marks the undeniable structural beginning of their long, slow imperial decline over the next 2 centuries.
The ripple effects of this defeat echoed across the globe, fundamentally altering strategic calculations far beyond Europe. A prime example can be found in the diplomatic archives of Safavid Iran.
The Safavids and the Ottomans had fought numerous bitter wars over territory in Mesopotamia and the Caucasus. So when news reached the Safavid court that the mighty Ottoman army had been shattered outside Vienna, they were thrilled.
The sources indicate that Shah Suleiman I actively contemplated capitalizing on the disaster. He seriously considered launching a massive eastern invasion to recapture the wealthy city of Baghdad.
He saw a rival empire on its knees and considered striking the killing blow. But they held back. They didn't launch the invasion. Why?
It was a decision rooted in cold, pragmatic self-awareness. The Safavid court, which was heavily influenced at the time by a cautious political faction, recognized their own internal limitations.
They understood that their own military apparatus was currently weak, suffering from a lack of funding and recent modernization.
More importantly, they realized a complex geopolitical truth. They realized they needed the Ottomans.
Exactly. While humiliating their longtime rival was satisfying, entirely destroying Ottoman power in the West might remove a massive necessary buffer state.
If the Ottoman Empire collapsed entirely, Iran might soon find itself sharing a direct border with an increasingly powerful, aggressive, and technologically advanced Christian Europe.
They chose strategic caution over immediate opportunism, deciding that a weakened Ottoman neighbor was preferable to a European one.
When we step back and look at the long-term legacy of this battle, the irony regarding the actual victors is incredibly striking.
King John III Sobieski won the eternal glory of the day. He led the most famous cavalry charge in history. He was universally hailed across the continent as the savior of Europe.
His letters to the Pope were celebrated, his portraits were painted, and his name was cemented in military history.
But politically and territorially, what did he actually gain? Very little. He gained massive prestige, but it did not translate into lasting structural power for Poland.
He failed to establish a strong hereditary dynasty to solidify the crown, and shortly after his reign, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth would descend into severe internal political paralysis and decline.
The true long-term victors of the 17th century were undeniably the Habsburgs.
The successful defense of Vienna, followed by the massive territorial acquisitions confirmed at the Treaty of Karlowitz, allowed the Austrian Empire to consolidate immense centralized power in Central Europe.
They established a sprawling, unified hegemony along the Danube River basin that would define the political structure of European politics for the next 200 years.
Which leaves us with a stark, almost tragic reminder about the law of unintended consequences in global geopolitics.
Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth exhausted its treasury, marched its army across mountains, and sacrificed the lives of its elite military class to save the Habsburg capital from destruction. That singular heroic decision preserved the Austrian Empire. Yet, just a few decades later, that very same empowered, hyper-secure Austrian Empire would actively participate in the brutal partitions that systematically carved up and wiped the Polish nation entirely off the map of Europe. It is a chilling reminder that in the cold calculus of empires, today's grateful savior can effortlessly become tomorrow's ruthless conqueror. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.